Hi everyone, it's week 11 of practicing Stoicism. All right, this week we're talking about several remarks. Last week was just a single lengthy remark. This week it's sections 34 through 40. These are continuing to be remarks that primarily focus on how we act. All right, let's start with 34, which is quite interesting. This is focusing on pleasure. And we saw part of this in Farnsworth's discussion. Epictetus identifies pleasure as something that we can get an impression of. And obviously, it wouldn't be pleasure that we're having, it would be an impression of pleasure that we might anticipate. And he says, in a case like that, like with all impressions, um, we need to be careful that we don't get carried away by it. Okay. In fact, what he says is you need to guard yourself against being carried away by it, just as you should do with impressions in general. All right. So, but I take it that these kinds of impressions, right, anticipating pleasure are ones that it's especially hard. They're the ones that we can maybe really get carried away by. So they're going to pose a special challenge for us. And what Epictetus recommends is a couple of things. One, he says, is you can just let it wait, right? Pause for a little while. Um, Another thing is you can engage in a kind of imaginative exercise. You can think about different scenarios. First, he says, thinking about, suppose you do enjoy a certain pleasure. In that case, he says there are two moments to consider. One is, well, what will it be like when you actually enjoy the pleasure? And then a second moment, which will come later, he says, which you will find displeasing when you regret that, where you might experience sorrow or anger at yourself. So he's sort of inviting you to kind of, don't think about that pleasure, which might, the initial impression might be overwhelming. Don't think about it in isolation. Think about it both in terms of like having the pleasure, but also the after effects. And then he says, hey, contrast that with another scenario where you don't enjoy the pleasure, right? Where instead you abstain. And he says, imagine the joy and the satisfaction you might feel if you're able to do that, right? You'd have a certain kind of self-control, certain kind of temperance, like we were talking about today. Um, Now, of course, he acknowledges there are going to be times where you may conclude that this is a pleasure that it's appropriate for you to enjoy, right? To embark on, as he puts it. And he says, so in a case like that, then we're not talking about whether to enjoy it or not, but now there's a new focus, which is you should aim at not being overwhelmed by whatever it is that you are enjoying, like the charm of it, the sweetness, the allure. Instead, he says, think how much better it will be um, if you win a little victory here, the victory of not being overwhelmed. Obviously, I think he thinks the bigger victory would be you abstain outright. You don't indulge in the pleasure at all, right? I mean, maybe there's a kind of an anti uh, Epicurean or hedonistic sort of strain that we sometimes find in the Stoics, especially maybe more Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius than Seneca. But even if you do enjoy the pleasure, he says, try not to be overwhelmed by it, right? So enjoy it in a moderate way, perhaps is one way we might take that. Um, okay, the second remark that we considered is 35. And this is talking about doing something that you conclude you ought to do, even if you know that other people, maybe people in general, are not going to approve. Maybe they're going to criticize you. And what he says is, look, you need to just focus on um, being open with what you do, right? If you decide something is right, do it, and don't be afraid of criticism, especially from people that may be confused or not appreciate what actually is right and wrong. Um, Obviously, if it's not the right thing to do, you just shouldn't do it. But if you conclude that it is the right thing to do, he says, don't be afraid. So, yeah, I think that the key there is he's stressing the value that the Stoics assign to a certain kind of openness about the things that we believe are good and that we're choosing to do. Okay, remark 36. This one's a little hard to parse, and our translation has given us a little bit of help. Um, there's some logical terminology in it, and so there's a contrast drawn between um, a valid disjunction and an invalid conjunction. What's a disjunction? A disjunction is either A or B. A conjunction is A and B. So notice that like a disjunction, the or is working, a conjunction, the and is working. And what Epictetus provides us initially is an example of something that would be true if it were a disjunction, but false if it were a conjunction. So what does he mean? He says, think about the two claims, it is day and it is night. It's always true that if you combine those and join them with the or, that will always be true. It is day or it is night. That's always going to be true. On the other hand, if you combine those with an and, it is day and it is night, that's always going to be false. All right, so he's just sort of pointing out the role of these, and then he turns again to a practical, ethical situation. In this case, a case where you are attending a dinner party. And you have to make a choice about how large a portion of some food that's being served for you to take, right? Now, one possibility is you take a large portion, and that would be something that would say benefit your body. Another possibility, he says, is you take a smaller portion as a way of showing your respect for the host, of maintaining sociability, as he puts it. So those are two possibilities, and you can imagine, right? I think if we go back to the idea of a disjunct, how would that work? You could put it into a claim which would always be true, right? Either choose something that is, choose a larger share, and so get something that's good for your body, or choose a smaller share, and so get something that is respectful to your host. Either one, it will be true, so the whole thing will be true, right? Choosing a larger thing is good for your body. Maybe that's one half of it. Choosing a smaller thing is respectful to your host. Combining them together, it gets a little trickier. How should we think about it in that case? Well, maybe it would be the share that you have chosen has value for your body, or the share that you have chosen has value for your host. That might be our true disjunct. So could we combine that? The share that you have chosen has value for your body, and the share you have chosen has value for your host? No. Like that, at least in general, the idea is going to be you take the bigger portion, it benefits your body, but it undermines social relations. You take the smaller portion, it doesn't benefit your body as much, but it upholds social relations. So they seem to be mutually exclusive. You either have to do one or the other. And what Epictetus says is, look, if you're in a situation like that, obviously he thinks sociability is more important than your body. Okay, so he's suggesting, but look at the way he puts it. He says, when you're dining with someone, be mindful not only to note the value of the dishes for your body, but also to show respect for your host. So be aware of both things. And I think it's not impossible. You could have a scenario where taking the largest portion was actually compatible with showing respect for your host. Maybe it's just you and your host, and they really like to cook, and they've made a nice meal that they know you will like, and you are a bigger person. You eat a lot more than they do. Maybe they don't eat much. They will be disappointed if you don't take a big, healthy portion. And it turns out a big healthy portion would also be good for your body. So it's possible you could have a scenario like that. But I think what Epictetus is really focusing on is that case where if you have to choose between one or the other, notice that upholding social relations is much more important than providing nourishment to your body. Right? You can get some more food after the dinner party if you're still hungry. Okay, so that's remark 36. Moving on to 37, and some of these are quite short, right? So 37, he says, if you have taken on a role that is beyond your capacity, then you have demeaned yourself, right? So you've done something you're not up for, you're not going to fare well. And in doing that, he says, you've also passed up a role that you could have filled credibly. So this is a theme we've encountered before. It just means paying attention to the roles that seem, that fate or nature or Zeus have provided you with, or have remember, like there's this sort of idea that if you think of life as a play, you will be given one or more roles to play, and you're supposed to play them as well as you can, but it's not so much up for you to choose. And so maybe even just the idea of choosing a role already suggests we're on the wrong path. But the other way to put it is, if you have some possible roles in front of you, you need to be self-aware. You need to examine what you're capable of and try to settle on one or more roles that you can perform well, right? And that was something that, remember, when Epictetus was talking about whether you were choosing to try to train as an Olympic athlete or choosing to lead the life of a philosopher, that you had to appreciate both what was involved in the role, but also your own capabilities and what you were what you possibly could do and what you were willing to do. What kinds of sacrifices, what kind of time were you willing to put in? Were you willing to live in a certain way, even if it was quite different from how others you know and care about live? Okay, so that's sort of a return to that theme. The next one I think is a quite interesting one. This is 38, and he says, he draws a parallel between the care that we take in walking and the care that we should take in making use of our commanding faculty. We haven't seen this term before, but the commanding faculty, it's another term, or maybe actually we have seen it once before, but it's a less common term that Epictetus uses for talking about your faculty of choice or your moral purpose. In both cases, we're talking about that part of you that he thinks of as the real you, the part that's involved with managing impressions, choosing to do good things, avoiding bad things, that sort of thing. And what he says is, look, when you are walking, right, what do you walk with? You walk with your feet. And as you walk with your feet, you try not to harm the thing that you need to walk, your feet, right? So you try to avoid stepping on a nail, for example, or twisting your ankle. In both those cases, you would interfere with your ability to walk, right? If you hurt your feet. Same thing. How might you harm your ruling faculty, your commanding faculty? Well, you would harm it by doing bad things, right, rather than good things, by giving in to certain impressions, by being carried away by certain impressions, by experiencing certain emotions, disruptive, disturbing emotions. So, and if you did that, that might interfere with your ability to make choices properly, right? Like that's, if you're sort of thinking about, well, what is it that quote unquote allows you to walk? In this case, well, it's your commanding faculty. Okay, so if you are careful in this way, right, avoiding harm to it, he says, this is a rule that we can follow in the actions that we do. And if we do that, we will do everything more securely. So cultivate, care for your commanding faculty, your power of choice. And if you do that, then everything you do will have a kind of firmness and security behind it. And this is something I think that we should keep. It reminds me all the way back to remark 2, when, remember, he said, look, initially you may have to set desire to one side, and you may have to limit and redirect what you are averse to. And he recommends, right, that as you are making choices, that you tread lightly, right, and that you do these things with reservation, as if you are a kind of a patient, right? You're somebody who's healing, somebody who is making progress, but is not yet strong, not yet fully formed. So if you had an injury in your foot you were recovering from, you would be especially careful, right, not to hurt your foot. Same thing, you want to be especially careful as you're trying to cultivate and strengthen that commanding faculty. Okay, sticking with feet return in remark 39. And here we got an interesting, the foot is used to help us understand a claim about the body. He says the body is the proper measure for each person's acquisitive needs. What does that mean? It means that if you're trying to figure out what you need, right, and this is a very sort of Thoreauvian point, the body is something you can turn to or consult, like to figure out what you need and what you should go after. Think about, well, what is it that the body actually requires? Okay. He says this is the same as the foot being a measure for a shoe. What does that mean? It means if you're trying to determine what type of shoe to get, right? What are your needs when it comes to shoes? Look to the foot. The shoe is primarily about protecting your foot, right? Allowing you to walk around, do things, right? Maybe you need a strong sole so that nails don't hurt your foot, or you need something to protect your feet from the weather, whether it's from the rain or from the snow, right? Depending on what you're going to be doing, you might need a special kind of shoe or boot. That's what he says. Like you focus on the foot and what it is that the shoe needs to protect. The shoe needs to protect the foot. It needs to keep the foot warm or cool or what have you, and so on and so forth. That should be your measure, he says. And he says if you stick to this rule, right, keeping this measure, like then you'll be okay. You won't, you're the things you go after that you try to acquire won't be excessive. But if you don't, right, if you go beyond that, he says you will in effect go over a cliff. And he says it's the same thing with a shoe. If you don't, so in the first case, do you use the body as your measure? In the second case, it's do you use the foot as your measure for getting shoes? If you don't, suddenly, right, there are no limits. There's all sorts of kinds of shoes that you might find yourself drawn to, like a gilded shoe, right, or one that's been embroidered, or that's the color of purple. And he basically says now there's no limit, and so that's kind of the worry, that like suddenly your what you want, what you desire, it's not tied to what you properly need, right? Remember what Thoreau called one of the necessaries of life. Once you no longer tie it to that, now you're in the realm of luxuries, and there's a worry, yeah, that they can just grow and grow and have no limit. Okay, so I think that's quite a nice passage myself. And then the last one is a remark about women. Now, women haven't figured much in the handbook, right? This is primarily written to men. Obviously, I think most of the ideas and points that Epictetus is making apply to both men and women. They can inform how you live your life. But it's true that you can tell, like, the audience is male, right? And so mainly when women come up, they are typically referred to as wives. They are spouses of Epictetus's primary audience, right? Frequently, they are the children of his audience are dying, and he's talking with them about how to respond to that event, to that loss, right? Here, the focus is different. Here, he's talking about a a kind of a cultural practice, right? Where and it's not a nice cultural practice, right? He says it's common that for women, he says, to experience this. He says when they turn 14, they are often called ladies, quote unquote, by men. And associated with that, of course, is a kind of suggestion that what their primary value is connected to sex, right? Going to bed with them. And he says basically, if young women, 14-year-olds, right, we're talking about, if they see that, they may begin to think that what is most important about them is how they look physically, right? Are they physically attractive or not? Or how they dress? Do they wear makeup? And basically Epictetus is so he's identifying a practice, which I take it he does not agree with, right? That he is critical of. He thinks, basically it exists. So, I mean, what lies behind it is that men viewing women in this way, objectifying them, seeing them as primarily just occasions for men to enjoy themselves sexually or something like that, right? And what he's saying is women, especially young women, come to tie their sense of their own value and themselves with that practice. So to counter that, he says, instead, what's important for them to understand, right? They need to come to see this, and hopefully, I think the idea is that this practicing Stoic that he's addressing will also uphold this value, right? That the true basis for being respected as a person, right, as a woman, is to appear refined and modest. Okay, so that's sort of shifting the focus from sex and physical, I don't know, attractiveness to modesty, refinement, a kind of more self-contained sense in which a woman values herself for herself, right? For her mind, for her character. I think that's the basic picture. It's a little compressed. It would have helped if we had another sentence or two to sort of flesh this out, but that seems to be the basic idea. Okay, that's it for this week. I will see you guys next week.